Well, he's definitely immortal.
So, a new Mortal Kombat is upon us, and with it comes a new story. If you watched my previous video on the subject, which I recommend if you haven't seen it, I discussed my excitement for the story potential in the latest installment of the Mortal Kombat franchise. Well, since Mortal Kombat 1 decided to implement their weird play your game early if you pre-order process, the entire story for the game is now online. I just want to say thank you real quick to the good folks at IGN. Because of you, I got to save $70. Thank you, video game journalists, for posting the entire story on your corporate YouTube channel for some reason. As I mentioned in the previous video on this subject, for me the story is the biggest draw of this franchise. So I basically just got to watch a 3.5 hour long movie without having to button mash through any parts of it. For this review, there will be spoilers for the story, however I can give a few spoiler-free thoughts here before moving on to the real meat of the video. First up, let's broadly talk about the story itself. It isn't anything that I would call too fancy. The first, I want to say 2/3 are relatively simple. There's an initial introduction to the conflict of our story, and then we get to meet our heroes who answer our call to adventure. Going by the IGN video, it's about 30 to 40 minutes of preliminary establishment, without the gameplay being added in, of course, until things start to heat up. The story continues to escalate at a pace that I say feels fairly consistent, if a bit rushed at times. The story itself is really interested in just telling you that something happened off screen and moving on to the next fight. For folks who like to see everything explored in your story, that will leave you with wanting more. Characters just simply arrive from point to point, the journey itself being glossed over until we meet a new companion and/or villain. Speaking of glossed over, or telling rather than showing, many characters seem to just blurt out their entire backgrounds and motivations. Not much is really told through actions or expressions. It's like at times they figured the audience had no time for anything too deep, because gameplay needs to happen and watching people talk to each other in a cutscene isn't as exciting as punching them. The final third is when things ramp up to a degree that seems ridiculous even by Mortal Kombat standards, which is saying something. The problem is, the setup in the first 2/3 kinda gets thrown out for what feels like an entirely new plot. I'm curious about how things went down in the writer's room. I would love to be a fly on that wall. I'm sure Devora probably was. So basically, I think the story is enjoyable by Mortal Kombat standards. It's got all your goobers punching each other, and it has a neat orchestral soundtrack going on to make it feel more like a mainstream movie. And like a mainstream movie, it's more style over substance. That isn't a bad thing if that's what you want, and there is heart to it. But at this point, I was really hoping the games would start to evolve more with their writing, as opposed to just evolving their graphics. Okay, now with all that said, it's spoiler time. So, I want to touch upon a couple things. First off, Baraka and Reptile finally got some time to shine. It was great to see them in a more heroic light, and it was nice to explore their backgrounds a bit as well. However, the quicker pace of the story usually meant that they just told you their entire story all at once. I would have liked it if Baraka in particular felt some more emotions when killing fellow Tarkatans. These are folks afflicted with the plague just like him. I don't know, from the way his bio read on Twitter and his introduction in the Gotti trailer, it kinda sounded like he was going to be more of a revolutionary leader type. But still, what Baraka we got was fun, if very brief. He isn't in the story for very long before he kinda just vanishes, and then we don't see him again until later if you choose. As for Reptile, he got a bit more to do in the story, being a big distraction and taking down elite warriors and princesses. He also kinda just vanishes. In fact, about everyone we started out with, Raiden, Kung Lao, Kenshi, Johnny Cage, and Ashura, all kinda just get brushed aside. It really was a shame because that group of characters were probably some of the most engaged I've felt with Mortal Kombat's writing in a while. Sure, their writing wasn't that deep, but they made up for it with some very fun character dynamics. Kung Lao is cocky while Raiden tries to be more humble. Johnny Cage makes for a good comedic foil to Kenshi's more serious and honorable demeanor. Reptile and Baraka both become a bit closer as they share much in common with being pariahs and outcasts themselves. Asha was fun with how she helped progress the plot and establish more realms and lore to the new timeline. I saw a Reddit post that likened the group to a D&D party, and I gotta agree. They're all distinct badasses that bounce well off of one another. I would have preferred it if we just followed them for the whole story. But again, gameplay needs to happen, and it would be boring if you only played as just them. I'll also say that besides these folks, Melina especially got a lot more to do. Like Baraka and Reptile, she's in the good guy's corner now. And she also has a more established romantic relationship built up with Tanya. Sure, it was already shown in the other games, but it's still nice to see that facet of these characters maintained. I'm always a fan of more representation. Finally, for characters that I want to highlight, I think Liu Kang and Shang Tsung were both pretty neat as well. Liu Kang's difficulties with being a god and the responsibility he had with shaping an entire universe is a really neat part of his character. What must a person who has turned into a big G god go through when determining the destinies of everyone he cares about? And Shang Tsung is just as evil and cocky as ever. Dude is drenched in slime the moment he's introduced, and his shenanigans, which involve extremely disturbing and unethical experiments, drive the main conflict of the story. He's just fun with how much of a scumbag he is. No complaints from me. Most of the other characters were also pretty decent, if again a bit lacking in terms of depth. But I might as well address the elephant in the room, Naitara. She isn't given much to do in the story, and she exists only to get beaten up. And as for her voice acting, well...
That blade's enchanted.
It was forged to destroy evil. It's slain many of your vampire kind.
We can't help what we are. That we feed on blood doesn't make us evil.
Look, I'm not saying it's entirely Megan Fox's fault. I don't know everything that went on behind the scenes. What I can say is that it seemed like her voice acting direction lacked, I guess, direction? I'm not an expert on this, but even I could tell that Megan Fox's voice acting was not put up to the same standard as more professional voice actors. Plus, there seems like there's something off with how she sounds, like she was recorded with different equipment or in a different location. It's just weird, especially since they got someone else to voice her grunts and screams during gameplay. Very strange decision making all around. Moving on, in my other video I stated that I felt it was weird for normal dudes to take down folks who were incredibly powerful. Well, it still persisted in this installment, especially with Adenian royalty and guards. The Umgadi themselves were hyped up to be elite warriors, and yet they get beaten pretty easily by just about everyone. Tanya and the princesses were basically relegated to jobber status. It was kind of unusual to see, but I guess someone new has to take the abuse now that Baraka and Reptile are in the big leagues. The same can also be said for Rain, Naitara, Raiko, and Shao. For many fights in the story, these are the folks that will get their teeth knocked in. Again, someone's gotta be the punching bag. I just wish there was a better way to distribute these beatings. I will say, however, that the fights didn't look random or unnecessary this time. That's right, conflict actually had rational reasons for happening. No more, you cut me in line at the checkout, I'm gonna kick your ass, fights occurring. Usually, the fights happen for good reason in this game, be it immediate distrust due to actions that seem harmful, to direct conflicts of interest that have ramifications. I think in this aspect, NetherRealm really did learn, and I hope going forward that they continue on this path. With that said, the tournament was extremely short. It's literally just Raiden fighting a bunch of folks in a row, and half of them are off screen. As someone who really likes the tournament parts of these games, it was kinda disappointing to me. I'll also say that the amount of good guys in the story certainly did outweigh the bad. I think the developers realized this too, which brings us to the big climax of the story. So it turns out in the story that what we thought was Kronika causing problems turned out to actually be, wait for it, Shang Tsung from an alternate timeline. That's right, alternate timelines at a new hotness. We went from rewriting history and time travel to dealing with folks from what is essentially a multiverse. I think this is the part that kinda messes with my mind. What exactly is a multiverse anymore? Is it an alternate reality with the same characters doing different things? Or is it layered realms of existence like, is Outworld another reality? Where does it fit? Or is it like a planet? I guess at the end of the day, it's something that you shouldn't think about too hard because it's just an excuse for the invasion mode and different cosmetics to exist in canon. Because everything is canon now. Remember Mortal Kombat Snowblind? The film where Kano beat Kronika and runs like an apocalyptic looking Earth? That's technically canon now that different timelines have been established. That also means Mortal Kombat Annihilation could be canon. And that's terrifying. This all leads into my thoughts on the final third of the game. Basically, it's kind of like a retread of MK11. We have a bunch of different warriors assembled to fight their evil clones, except this time it's a multiverse rather than being based on time travel. The entire game itself seems to really like referencing the 3D era games by mentioning the Deadly Alliance, the Dragon King's army, and even recreating the Battle of Armageddon on a much larger scale on what appears to be the Pyramid of Argus. Except no blades for some reason. And it feels so weird to me. The beginning and middle of the story sets up a lot of threads with new Raiden and his Funky Bunch pals. And then Scorpion and his brother's betrayal, Sindel and the betrayal for closest allies, and those just get dropped because alternate universe Shang Tsung is an evil prick. Like, don't get me wrong, I love that Shang Tsung is so evil that he'll travel to another timeline just to trick a version of himself into granting him power to destroy it. Dude is a multiversal hater, and I gotta have huge respect for that. But then the final battle happens, and his big plan is to just have an army of evil versions of every Mortal Kombat character. And to fight him, Liu Kang assembles an army of good versions of every Mortal Kombat character. It just feels really difficult to explain because you kinda have to just watch the whole thing unfold. Like, I know I've skipped over some story details, because they just don't really matter when the story suddenly shifts into a completely new direction. And I will say, there's something novel about the spectacle of it all. The player gets to choose who they'll use for this final stretch, which feels kinda weird because you think it would just be Liu Kang who'd do everything. Instead, you kinda just assume an alternate universe good guy version of any of the characters available in the game. I'm assuming what it actually is a huge reference towards Mortal Kombat Armageddon with having every single fighter available, except, the base roster's like 21 characters. I will say though that even though it is a bit silly, it's also really ambitious as they have made cutscenes for each character in this final battle. However, they still play out the same way, so choosing a fighter is basically just whoever you think plays the best / is the most appropriate for this fight. Again, Liu Kang is the obvious answer, however, the Liu Kang you choose is still just some alternate timeline schmuck who gets to kick Shang Tsung's ass. Also, for some reason, the evil timeline versions that are fought in this sequence are combinations of two different characters but with funny names. Again, this is just going off the IGN footage, so I don't know if these are always said or if they're maybe random. Tonally, you have a battle that is even bigger than Armageddon with warriors from every imaginable timeline, and yet most of them are just kinda like shitposts. I appreciate tongue-in-cheek humor, but in the story it seems like nothing was around to really set up this shift. It just happens. And then once the final fight is over, Liu Kang meets with Raiden and pals and pats them on the back for a job well done. We aren't gonna linger more on what just happened, just job well done. Even though it was an alternate universe character that did it, they didn't kick Shang Tsung's ass. A Sundari Shao Kahn did. It's just such a strange thing to me, like, I was vibing pretty well with most of the story. Sure, it was a bit rushed just so each character could get their 3 fights in or whatever, but it still felt cohesive. Like, it was pretty tame and played things safe for the most part. Usually, I like it when games go bananas with their story and jump the shark, and despite how I may sound, I was impressed by what they did. But most of the story had not set up any of this effectively. I had no idea it was just going to be Super Infinity War. Every franchise wants their Portals moment, when all the warriors arrive all at once. The thing is, I think it has to be earned. Mortal Kombat 1 didn't earn it. It barely built up to it. It just had a massive final battle show up and said, "Ah yes, it was all leading up to this." Typically, I think the first installment in your new storyline should be a bit more tame in comparison. Overall, like I said in the non-spoiler portion, it is an enjoyable story. If you're a big Mortal Kombat fan, you might even love it. There were tons of little moments that made me really happy, and just seeing my boys Baraka and Reptile join the good guys made me feel like the price I paid, $0 and 3.5 hours of my life, was very much worth it. With what they've set up in the ending, with the Havoc making an appearance, not just the one that's on the normal roster, I'm sure the next game is going to be chaotic. Which means that what we've seen in the big final battle is probably going to be a mechanic in MK2. And at least when it happens in the next game, I'm sure I'll be more receptive to it. I think seeing it all suddenly happen just really fried my brain a bit. John Connor will do that to you. Either way, if you're bored and don't have the cash like me, I say watch the story mode video IGN released. It's entertaining, and it does make me glad that this franchise still exists after 30 years. With each new game, I do think that NetherRealm are improving on narrative aspects. My final suggestion would be that after you watch the story mode, you should also check out the tower endings for each character. Those have, in my own opinion, the best writing in the game, and each one appears to be canon, and not just in a multiverse sense. So with that all said, thank you all so much for watching this video. This will be the last Mortal Kombat related thing that I do for a long time, at least until the new movie comes out, whenever that is. The spooky month is showing up soon, and I got some really groovy reviews in store that I'm excited to do. With all that said, feel free to follow if you like the video. You don't have to, as just knowing folks have watched these makes it all worth it to me. With all that said, I hope you all have a wonderful day.
I applauded it for being different!
It broke new ground!